So welcome back. We're again here with Brian and Perry, and we're looking at a famous study that was done within Google. That's a more updated version of the project that Jim Collins started in looking at excellence. So Google did this Aristotle study in-house in a similar way that Jim Collins started his exploration in understanding excellence. Now, Collins started looking at excellence in organizations. The Aristotle study looked at excellence in teams. And I want to turn to Perry and Brian to just look at what is it that we can take away from this study.
Several interesting findings in this study that explain how highly functional teams work together. Some surprising variables that are not included in there were things that you would think have a high impact, like co-location, compensation, tenure. Actually didn't have a significant impact. It was psychological safety was number one. Motivation, impact were some of the other ones. But it's things that you would expect to find in the study were actually found to be not significant variables.
Yeah, I sort of read it as like, here's this central moment is psychological safety. That's what, creates an effective team. And then here's some ways that we achieve that. And, some of them you mentioned. One of the ones that resonated with me was, really defining the scope of work. I think a lot of people go into, and I think we discussed it a little bit earlier too, a lot of people go into team meetings with no real understanding of either what they're supposed to be doing or, how do we get there? And so, the overall overarching point was that if we include these different variables, then we can achieve psychological safety, which sort of, promotes, an effective team and has all sort of other outcomes like, we have the capacity for argumentation, or we have the capacity for a collaboration, or,
Right. And why do you think this is stunning? Why do you think this is in some way even like talked about? Like psychological safety is important. Integrity is important, that you can rely on people, dependable, right? That there's impact, et cetera, all these things. Why is this surprising? Why is this?
It's something that once you read it, it seems so self-evident that this would be a major psychological safety would be a major contributor to team success. But it's something that we don't think about every day. It's no different than. I know Perry has an extensive background in psychology, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, you have to fill your basic needs before you can get into, and that idea of safety inside of small groups is important. Again, after reading it, it seems self-evident, but it's something that we don't think about on a daily basis.
And why is that? Why do you think that is?
I think it's something that it is not really has not really been included in the ecosystem of the business world, and I believe that part of the reason why it hasn't been included is because we haven't been able to monetize it. We don't know how to turn something like that into money. But as the ecosystem has evolved, we started to look at, okay, well, teams contribute to our bottom line in this way. Okay, well, now that we know that, well, what makes an effective team? And so I think that this is in line with sort of the progression of what we've been learning about, not just including the idea of a team, but the idea of the individual in the team in terms of how they perform the best to make the team perform the best, to make the organization perform the best.
What do you think are some of the principles that undermine psychological safety in current businesses? Like, why isn't there psychological safety if it's sort of the foundational need, right?
Yeah, I think one major contributor is poor communication. I also think that another major contributor is lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities in teams, and lack of clarity of purpose. And to bring a Collins example in, also not being able to have tough discussions and facing the brutal facts.
But why is that? because that's where you need psychological safety. But why do we not have psychological safety in the majority of organizations? Right?
I think one of the biggest sort of things that undermine it is the concept of organizational stratification. You know, I'm this boss and you're there. And what that produces is a power dynamic where one person is allowed to show up a certain way and another person is not allowed to show up a certain way. And I think what are some of the mechanisms happening in the background is that, you know, if this person, you know, who makes $50,000 a year loses their job or puts themselves in a position to where they could lose their job by saying something that may be unpopular, they're at a much greater risk than someone who, you know, is a bit senior, makes a lot more money, probably has more savings, that kind of thing. And so there's an element of like, how can this disrupt my life if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing? So I think the concept of like stratifying an organization, it impedes on the process of psychological safety. And I'm not suggesting that we should have no organizational stratification, but we should consider the implication it has on power.
Right. So there's a source of power and maybe a principle of hire and fire. Right, that person above you, potentially, if it is a stratified, hierarchical organization, basically has the power to tell you, go home, you're out of a job. And that sort of instills a certain sense of psychological unsafety, right? And so that may be a basic principle that people have to work against if that is the kind of organization that they're operating in, right? But that means also, on the contrary, like it's very hard to create psychological safety then, right? And psychological safety may be something else than job safety or any other types of physical safety. But how do you think it can be created? Based on the study at Google, they're able to do it. The better teams are able to do it. What do you think is maybe at the source of that? You
know, one of the things that I picked up on, I don't know if it was exactly explained this way, is the hierarchy inside those teams. It's flatter. That it's not. There's not as many levels to the hierarchy in those teams where everybody feels like they're a contributor, and they feel empowered to contribute. So I think not having the steep hierarchy in the teams was.
So it's a flat team structure, but that typically a team is that, right? Is sort of like there is maybe one sort of supervisor or something. But even that, it may not necessarily lead to just simply creating the psychological safety, right? Because they have differences within teams. What do you think? How can you create?
I think that I have two thoughts about that. One is, you know, even if it's a flat team structure, to sort of promote, you know, to bring up to Collins, to promote internal humility and to promote sort of an inquiry-based or curiosity type of space. This is a space to be curious. This is a space to take intellectual risks. This is a space to get to, you know, to see where the gaps are. The other thought that I have is sort of based on the principle that, you know, human beings typically feel safer in circumstances that they can predict. And so instilling a level of predictability in how the space will operate, not insofar as what you can and cannot say, but more insofar as how will we act to what is said. And so the predictability comes in like, this is not how we will respond to comments that we disagree with. This is probably a better approach.
Okay. So the way that we interact with each other, the way there may be clarity about what the expectation is, what the role is, what the point is, right? What the reason is that we're together as a team can help. And it can sort of set a tone in a way that, yes, we're in it together. We're on a journey of inquiry. We don't advocate for something. We don't really know the solution, right? And nobody in the team knows the solution. So there is no hierarchy in terms of expertise. So everybody is actually asked to contribute. And if you can do that, if you can create that higher purpose, if you can create that kind of problem focus, if you can make it an inquiry rather than an advocacy for some certain product or solution, then you create an atmosphere for people to say, yeah, I want to pitch in. I have something to say, and this may be of value, or that may be of value, right? and we talked about this in other conversations, but I think this is where sort of the rubber hits the road, is people feel they're asked to contribute, right? And they're there to be contributing, not just sitting around, not just being warm bodies walking in and out. And maybe they're hired for that purpose, right? They're sort of hired to be in the team because they have an aligned kind of purpose why they're doing what they're doing. They're intrinsically motivated. They're the right people on the bus, you could say, right? And then you sort of make sure that once they're the right people, you create that culture of confronting the brutal facts. You're able to sort of say, you know what, this is maybe better. Let's try this. Let's do this, etc. And you have this kind of experimentation mode, the inquiry mode that we call it. So I want to turn back to the students and also just make the connections here again with some of the other conversations that were had and that we're having. And you remember possibly the distinction between an inquiry mode and an advocacy mode. The advocacy mode basically says somebody knows the solution and they're just advocating for it to be adopted. The inquiry mode is quite the opposite. It's like, we don't know the solution. It's like, let's figure it out. Let's ask a question. The advocacy mode is natural, quote unquote. It's the easy way. That's how we live our life. We know something. We figured something out. And then we want to convince others. And that works sometimes, especially in contexts where really we can figure out something. But in the context that many organizations are in, they actually don't know many things. And if they're smart and if they're pursuing excellence, then they're oftentimes in this inquiry mode, whether they want to be or not, but the question is how they handle it makes the difference. And that's what Google finds out. In their teams, the difference is how are they dealing with uncertainty? How can they create psychological safety? How can they create direction? How do they have integrity with each other in a way that they can rely on each other? How do they have a higher purpose, and how can they measure the impact that they're making on the world? These are things that fundamentally resonate, and I want to bring it back to the conversation also about the drive to defend. If you recall, the 4 drives, the drive to acquire, the drive to bond, the drive to comprehend, and the drive to defend. In the Google Aristotle study, I think you can find all those 4 drives being addressed. The teams that work best are the ones that resonate best with who we are as human beings, and specifically the drive to defend. And one of the big problems in current day organizations is that fundamentally they're violating the drive to defend with their setup of hiring and firing people, with having control over people. So the people typically are tiptoeing around and they're not clear that they actually can say what they want to say. And oftentimes this kind of conversation is relegated to the water cooler. People talk about it maybe at some other point and then they're quote unquote bitching. But in the context of great teams, that is not happening. There is the intention to, despite all the power hierarchy, create psychological safety and make sure that the right people are on the bus, the right people are in the team, and that there is the intention to inquire together and create better solutions to these problems. So I encourage you to think about that for yourself in your experience working in teams and around, look at around. Like where are these principles showing up that Google points to that are leading teams to excellence? And where are they not? Because most of the time, unfortunately, they're not.